Good evening. My name is Jacqueline Barber, and I'm the Executive Director of the University Committee on Human Rights Studies, a committee whose brief it is to coordinate the activities of all the different human rights centers and programs at Harvard University. Today is the first event in a year-long series of lectures, the theme of which is States, Society, and the Future of Rights. The series is intended to address the following question. Human rights traditionally has been conceived of as a set of norms and transnational mechanisms for curbing the tyrannical impulses of states, for constraining state power, for preventing governments from torturing or silencing their citizens. In short, we've thought of human rights as a set of tools for restricting the power of strong states. But today, we increasingly invoke human rights for another contrasting set of purposes: to enlarge the power of states, to fortify weak, failing, or failed states, to rebuild devastated societies so that the interests of citizens can be served. How do these two contrasting roles for human rights fit together? Is there such a thing as the international community which spans both these approaches? Do they create conflicts and inconsistencies? These are some of the questions that we will be addressing in the series. The event this evening is co-sponsored by the Carr Center for Human Rights Practice here at the Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. Future events will include a lecture by Angela Davis on US human rights record in collaboration with the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies and the Du Bois Institute, and a discussion on the relationship between debt and democracy between Amartya Sen and Jeff Sachs in collaboration with the Committee on Africa Studies. We very much hope you will join us for these future events. It's now my great pleasure to hand over the event to President Summers, who's been a great supporter of the committee's work, and to invite him to introduce our honorable speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you for everything you do. If you are able to bring together the work of a number of centers at Harvard University concerned with human rights successfully, I dare say a great career at the United Nations awaits you. I want to thank the Carr Center for their sponsorship of this event, and in particular to acknowledge Professor Michael Ignatieff, the director of the center, for all that he and his colleagues in the center have done for thinking about these issues in the university and far beyond. I am excited to be able to welcome to Harvard's forum someone who has had a remarkable career in public life. Mary Robinson was born in Ballina County, Mayo, attended Trinity College in King's Inn, Dublin, before coming to Harvard Law School in the late 1960s. She received a Master of Law from Harvard in 1968. No doubt that was the key turning point in her career. Subsequently returned to Ireland, where she joined the faculty of Trinity College as the Reed Professor of Constitutional and Criminal Law. 1969, Professor Robinson joined the Irish Parliament's Upper House, where she served for the next 20 years. Spending time also on the Dublin City Council and as a member of the International Commission of Jurists. In 1990, Mary Robinson was elected president by, as she put it, the women of Ireland who, instead of rocking the cradle, rocked the system. And it was not just the system in Ireland that was rocked. President Robinson became the first head of state to visit Rwanda following the genocide that occurred there. She was the first head of state to visit Somalia following the crisis there in 1992. And she was the first head of state to visit the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. Little wonder that Kofi Annan appointed Mary Robinson in 1997 to the post of United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. In 1998, she returned to Harvard as commencement speaker on the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She said then that the anniversary was not a time for celebration, it was a time for reflection in a somber and reflective way. She also said that the future success of our efforts to implement the Declaration can only be measured by the improved well-being of individuals around the world. Mary Robinson has certainly been no stranger to controversy during her tenure as High Commissioner for Human Rights. Most recently, it was suggested by some that her questioning of U.S. policy with regards to detainees in the war against terrorism cost her another term in office. She often quoted a friend who told her when she took the job, "Remember, if you get too popular in that job, it means that you are not doing a good job." The Irish writer Jonathan Swift once wrote, "Power is no blessing in itself, except when it is used to protect the innocent." That has been Mary Robinson's objective. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mary Robinson.
President Summers, distinguished faculty, fellow Harvard students and graduates, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great pleasure to be with you this evening. I'd like to thank President Summers for his very warm words. I couldn't think of a better place to give my first address after completing my term as High Commissioner for Human Rights than here at Harvard. Many of the issues and people I was first exposed to during my days here as a student were vital in shaping my thinking on human rights and indeed the life mission that I would choose. So I welcome this chance to look back and to look forward. The added pleasure is that this is also the first time in many years in which I can speak not as a representative of my country or as an official of a world body, but simply just as Mary Robinson, concerned citizen. I'd like to thank President Summers and the University Committee on Human Rights Studies for extending the invitation to open this university-wide lecture series on the theme of states, society, and the future of rights. I understand this is the first time all the human rights programs and centers at Harvard are collaborating on a joint initiative of this kind. I welcome your efforts to highlight the importance of interdisciplinary human rights studies in the academic curriculum, and I look forward to exploring the possibilities of this approach, both in my remarks here this evening and also in discussions tomorrow with students and faculty. The title of my address is "Making Human Rights Matter. Eleanor Roosevelt's Time Has Come." Making human rights matter sums up my conviction that human rights are the business of everyone. It also signals a concern that despite the progress that has been made in recent years in moving human rights to the center of the international agenda, the reality is that they are still viewed by many merely as rhetoric rather than as legal realities which must be taken seriously. Key to changing these views is education. If human rights are to be embraced and implemented at home and abroad, their study can't be restricted to the fields of law, political philosophy, or international relations. They must be explored and understood just as much by economists and entrepreneurs as by politicians, philosophers, and policy experts. But education alone won't be enough. The human rights obligations of states must be understood and taken seriously as legal obligations. Governments must understand that there are negative consequences for non-compliance and positive ones for implementation. The second half of my two-part title, Eleanor Roosevelt's Time Has Come, is intended as a reminder that the world agreed over 50 years ago on a common set of international human rights standards that are as critically important today in achieving freedom, justice, and peace in the world as when they were first proclaimed. Starting with the Universal Declaration and carrying forward in the body of international law that has been painstakingly developed over half a century, the world has expressed through human rights its shared commitment to the values of dignity, equality, and human security for all people. Our challenge is to give those values meaning, both in our own communities and in the global community of nations. We each have a responsibility to help realize the vision of the Universal Declaration. In Eleanor Roosevelt's words, to make human rights matter in small places close to home. I would only add that in today's world, when people and events on the next continent often feel as close as in the next state, we must also be willing to reconsider what home means and who our neighbour really is. So again, thank you for offering me this opportunity to share some thoughts with you on where human rights have been and where I believe they should be going. My last visit to Harvard, as President Summers mentioned, was in 1998, when the United Nations was marking the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I have made valiant attempts to pretend that I am the class of 98 rather than the class of 68, but my husband keeps undermining these attempts and I don't get anywhere with this rejuvenation. Be that as it may. At that time, in 1998, I was still new in the job of High Commissioner and still searching for how best to use my mandate to advance the cause of human rights around the world. And this isn't in my text, but for those of you interested, I really didn't know how I was going to do it. So don't ever be afraid that you don't know. Sometimes that's part of the process. On that occasion, too, I referred to Eleanor Roosevelt's role in the early days of the UN's human rights work. Now, having read Mary Ann Glendon's excellent book, A World Made New, which traces the drafting process which led to the adoption of the Universal Declaration, I'm even more conscious of the enormous debt the world owes to Eleanor Roosevelt. I stressed in 1998 her conviction that if rights didn't have meaning locally, they would have little meaning elsewhere. As she put it, without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. Taking this statement as a point of departure is a useful way to reflect briefly on my time as High Commissioner for Human Rights. For in many ways, I believe it's the phenomenon of an emerging global civil society movement for human rights, committed to translating universal principles into local realities, which best captures the developments of the past 5 years. I was told there was water under here, and there is. Good. When I began my term as High Commissioner, there was already a sophisticated network of groups around the world who were active in promoting human rights and speaking out on behalf of victims. I just can't count the number of times over the past 5 years that these human rights activists provided me with invaluable insights and information. Before each of my country missions, it was my practice to invite NGOs to meet with me for briefings. These encounters frequently shaped the agenda of my meetings in the countries concerned. I also benefited from and drew on the human rights research and analysis done within the NGO community. Over the past year in particular, I noticed a transformation in how human rights activists, despite having different agendas, were increasingly linking their activities with groups addressing economic and social development, the environment, and other issues of global concern. I saw this most profoundly last month in Johannesburg at the World Summit on Sustainable Development. Global civil society has now recognized that the path to sustainable development requires explicit respect for international human rights standards. Unfortunately, this affirmation was largely resisted by governments in Johannesburg. Yet, despite their willingness to embrace these connections in the formal documents of the summit, the reality is that the debate has moved on ahead of governments. The broad human rights agenda, covering civil and political, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, which was initiated over half a century ago, was seen in Johannesburg as being of deep relevance across the broad range of issues on the summit agenda. From rights relating to the environment, such as access to clean water, to public health and HIV/AIDS, from corporate social responsibility to economic development, the environmental, development, and human rights communities have never been so joined in common mission and agenda as they are today. I've witnessed the emergence of a powerful movement for change through NGOs engaging in a deeper democratic discourse, using the tools of the legal commitments governments have made under the 6 core international human rights instruments. Human rights NGOs in different regions of the world are working with governments in preparing the reports to the 6 treaty monitoring bodies and, where necessary, preparing parallel or alternative reports. In the last few months alone, I've seen this for myself in Cameroon, South Africa, Mexico, Peru, in Cambodia, East Timor, and even beginning in China. In addition, development NGOs such as Oxfam are now adopting a rights-based approach in their work. They're aware of the human rights covenants and conventions the country in question has ratified. They know what reports have been submitted on steps taken by the government and the comments of the relevant committees. And they know if there have been visits and reports of any of the special rapporteurs of the UN Commission on Human Rights. They're linking this information to their own work, and in particular, how they seek to empower civil society groups in using this framework to push for results. It was NGOs, after all, that mounted the campaign for a great institutional development, the International Criminal Court, and long may they continue on reinforcing that court. It was natural for me as High Commissioner to look to women's groups and individual women to support human rights work, and also to encourage and support the fight for women's rights. I have a rich kaleidoscope of memories of how literally thousands of women in every region are engaged in practical projects, courageous activism, and vital research. Whether they're combating poverty and discrimination, whether they're insisting on reproductive rights, whether they're working for peace in zones of conflict, or whether they're giving leadership in political and economic spheres, the fascinating development is that the approach is increasingly rights-based. Women are using the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and its optional protocol. They're drawing on the Convention on the Rights of the Child to support the rights of the girl child. And they're drawing on the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to address issues such as the feminization of poverty. A valuable dimension of this rights-based approach is that it applies equally to developed and developing countries, and to countries in transition. We're seeing emerge a sophisticated, literate women's movement worldwide, which knows that women's rights are not just about words and advocacy, but about pinning governments to their legal commitments and making use of these tools, both at the national level and internationally. Yes, we are on the verge of a world made new. Another area I'd like to highlight in looking back over my term as High Commissioner is the change I've seen in the United Nations system. The UN has made significant advances in the past 5 years under the leadership of Kofi Annan, both in reaching out to civil society and the private sector, and in integrating human rights more fully into the organization itself. When I began my term, the human rights work of the UN was largely isolated from the activities of the UN at headquarters or in countries around the world. Today, human rights play a central role in the UN's development activities. The presence of human rights specialists is also becoming a standard feature of peacekeeping and other UN post-conflict operations. I'm convinced that this process is firmly in place and will continue in the years ahead. A challenge for my successor, Sergio Vieira de Mello, will be in further mainstreaming human rights into efforts to support countries rebuilding after conflict, such as Afghanistan and Sierra Leone, as well as assisting the large number of countries striving towards sustainable development for their people. The new High Commissioner, as you know, has extensive experience in UN fieldwork, and I believe that the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights can make an enormous contribution in helping the UN to further operationalize the human rights dimensions of its activities in every part of the world. Five years on then, human rights are now firmly on the agenda of the international community. The arguments about whether human rights are universal, whether they could be made operational, whether they have a serious place in the conduct of international relations are still heard in some circles, but in lower tones. Today, most governments will at least acknowledge that human rights have a role to play. Unfortunately, that's not necessarily to say that they will all observe human rights standards. You will still hear governments arguing they must place other factors first. The difference is that today, claims of that sort go against the tide of public opinion. There's much greater recognition now of the centrality of democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights to long-term peace and security, and economic and social development. And there's recognition of the importance of a United Nations that can claim universal legitimacy in addressing global challenges. So I'm confident in saying that progress has been made in recent years in strengthening human rights. But my assessment is tempered by events over the past year, which I believe create a climate of uncertainty for human rights. The horrific terrorist attacks on the United States and the response to these events in various countries is, of course, on all our minds. But I would also point to the Durban World Conference Against Racism and the last session of the UN Commission on Human Rights as examples of where human rights progress has encountered significant challenges. Let me say a few words about each. Some voices are heard suggesting that after the terrible attacks here in the United States on the 11th of September, human rights are somehow to be curtailed, that the security imperative outweighs these considerations. I do not believe that, not for a moment. I said immediately after 9/11, and have repeated on numerous occasions since, that the scale and systematic nature of the attacks on New York and Washington qualified these acts as crimes against humanity under international jurisprudence. I stressed the duty on all states to find and punish those who planned and facilitated these crimes. I also echoed the words of Kofi Annan and other world leaders who stressed that there's no trade-off between effective action against terrorism and the protection of human rights. Unfortunately, what I saw and heard in my final year as High Commissioner was undemocratic regimes using the tragedy in the United States of 9/11 to pursue their own repressive policies, secure in the belief that their excesses would be ignored. Also troubling, democratic governments have taken measures which run counter to international law. These cases have been documented by respected organizations such as Amnesty International and Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. As you know, the UN Security Council has established a Counter-Terrorism Committee, which in my view is a genuinely innovative and forward-looking approach. In many ways, it's similar to the way governments report under the human rights reporting system to a treaty body, in that it requires governments to report on the steps they're taking to combat terrorism. Although protection of human rights is not primarily the responsibility of the Security Council, the Counter-Terrorism Committee has also acknowledged the need to take into account the expertise of other United Nations bodies and to make sure that the measures adopted by governments don't unduly curtail human rights. For example, the UN Human Rights Committee's General Comment number 29 on states of emergencies and derogations from provisions of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides important guidance in ensuring respect for the non-derogable provisions of the Covenant. These provisions remain binding and remain an essential consideration for all states, parties, as they adopt measures to fight terrorism. The challenge now is to maintain the integrity of the international human rights and humanitarian law norms in the light of heightened security tensions, while at the same time building a world of true human security. The UN Commission on Human Rights should take it upon itself to play a leading role in such efforts. If we're to succeed, combating terrorism must also become an effective war on disadvantage, discrimination, and despair. An equally worrying trend over the past year has been a resurgence of anti-Semitism, notably in Europe, and a coarsening of the debate and language used in speaking about the Islamic world, about immigrants, and about asylum seekers. Taken together, I fear that the forces of intolerance and discrimination are on the rise around the world. In the days before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the world, as you will recall, was addressing these issues in Durban at the World Conference Against Racism. In looking back on my time as High Commissioner, I must say that that conference, decided on by the General Assembly before I became High Commissioner, and to which I was nominated or volunteered as Secretary General, was one of the most frustrating and yet at the same time rewarding experiences. The conference was extraordinarily difficult. It was bound to be, for it addressed some of the most contentious issues faced by every country and by the international community. What I regret most is the hateful language that was used by some participants in bracketed draft text and at discussions in Durban itself. I, as well as the vast majority of other representatives from governments and from civil society present, condemned these examples of intolerance. But the damage was done, and these voices of hate overshadowed the real progress that was made in Durban. That progress involved all of the negative text being removed before a final document was adopted by consensus on the 8th of September 2001. What's also disturbing is that as criticism of Durban continues, particularly here in the United States, it's clear that few of the strongest critics have read the final documents of the conference. This is unfortunate, as the Declaration and Programme of Action are powerful tools for lobbying governments, educating people, empowering civil societies, and establishing frameworks for dialogue. There are specific calls and strategies for countering anti-terrorism, challenging rising xenophobia, and protecting minorities, indigenous peoples, migrants, and other vulnerable groups should be used and not discarded out of hand. The other event I wish to refer to as a cause for concern during my last year as High Commissioner is the session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, which ended in late April. At its closing session, I encouraged the 53 member states of the Commission to reflect deeply on the divisive debates and block votes that had taken place. I heard distress and concern voiced by the human rights movement that increased politicization of issues in the Intergovernmental Commission was to the detriment of true human rights concerns. Developing countries argued that there is too much criticism of them. But is it not right that when there are situations of gross violations of human rights, the UN's main human rights body should seek to protect the victims? And if it's felt that the existing methods aren't adequate, isn't there a responsibility on the membership of the Commission to consult and to find adequate ways of helping to protect the victims of such violations? A recent report of an international commission articulated the duty of the international community to come to the protection of those whose rights are being grievously violated. They highlighted what they encapsulated as the responsibility to protect. The prevention of gross violations of human rights must be the starting point of the human rights agenda of the future. And it is to the future I would now like to turn. So how do we make human rights matter, as my title suggests? How can Eleanor Roosevelt's vision of our shared responsibility for realizing human rights make a difference in an increasingly interconnected world? There are two areas where I plan to concentrate my own future efforts in addressing these questions, and where I'd welcome the involvement of this great university, which is already doing so much to advance the study and implementation of human rights around the world. My first objective is to bring the rights-based approach and experience of the human rights community into the wider debate on globalization and work with others to shape a more ethical globalization. Many human rights advocates recognize the potential of this normative legal framework to be a vehicle for human development and democracy. Yet little has been done to date within the framework of international human rights norms to protect and promote the interests of those who are currently excluded from the perceived benefits of globalization. Today's globalization has left many people feeling, and rightly so, that they have been left behind. They feel powerless and see their governments as being unable to respond to local and national priorities. Many of the countries which made progress during the 80s and 90s in opening up their markets and political systems have been met with increased social and economic tensions, and some have even fallen back into authoritarianism or conflict. The reasons for this come down, I believe, to failures of governance. A failure of developed countries to open their markets, to reduce the protection of domestic industries, where developing countries have the best chance of competing. A failure to support developing countries committed to tackling poverty, to joining the technology revolution. Equally, many developing countries have failed in holding their leaders accountable, in combating corruption, in enforcing the rule of law. We need only consider some shocking statistics to know that globalization isn't making life better for all people. Every 24 hours, more than 30,000 children around the world die of preventable diseases. 6.3 million children die each year of hunger. Women are still the poorest of the world's poor, 800 million of them, representing 2/3 of those living on less than $1 a day. 1,000 million people are still without access to clean water supplies, and 2.4 billion people lack access to basic sanitation. It's clear that a human rights approach adds value by giving civil society the tools to hold governments accountable. The rights-based approach is being brought to new levels by initiatives such as the expert consultative work carried out to develop guidelines for a human rights approach to poverty reduction strategies. I have to say, I think this was the most innovative work during my last months as High Commissioner. I was very proud to support the consultants, and I have a copy for those who are interested later, and it's on our website of the Office of High Commissioner. The draft guidelines are now available and will be tested by UN programs as well as organizations such as the World Bank, as they help states in formulating, implementing, and monitoring their national poverty reduction strategies. The challenge is to build on such initiatives and use them to influence other aspects of the globalization equation. The second area I'll be focusing on is to help, in a low-key way, to fill a gap which troubles me in human rights at the international level. We still don't put enough emphasis on helping developing countries to build their own national protection systems for human rights. While the importance of human rights and democracy to sustainable development is now widely recognized, far too little of the necessary intellectual and financial resources needed for human rights education, for effective administration of justice, rule of law, and popular participation in local and national decision-making has been made available to developing countries. I plan to focus initially on working through the framework of the new Partnership for Africa's Development, the NEPAD. African government leaders, as you know, have committed themselves through NEPAD to delivering pluralist states with transparent administrations, effective institutions, and sound regulatory frameworks, all underpinned by the rule of law and respect for international human rights standards. African leaders have made these commitments, but questions hang over how innovative approaches, such as the peer review mechanism, whereby governments will hold each other accountable for good governance, will be implemented. Clearly, resources, both financial and intellectual, are desperately needed if we hope to see changes. Building a national protection system must be country-led, requiring both the political will of the government and the involvement of civil society, and help from the outside must be offered in support so that the approach is truly sustainable. My hope is that new and existing links between universities, research centres, and professional legal bodies in the North with counterparts in individual African countries could be developed. In this way, increased resources could be marshalled for projects to support human rights capacity building in these countries. I'm pleased that I will be supported in this project, in this work, on both of these objectives by a partnership of 3 distinguished organisations with a proven record and commitment to addressing challenges facing our unequal world: the Aspen Institute, the State of the World Forum, and the Geneva-based International Council on Human Rights Policy. We're calling this new project the Ethical Globalization Initiative. What's very clear to all of us involved is that we'll need to engage a broad range of partners in achieving the objectives I have outlined. So this is the point at which I turn to all of you for your ideas and engagement. How can Harvard expand the circle further by bringing the human rights message to an even wider student and faculty community? Equally important, what more could you do to make human rights matter here at home and around the world? I'm aware that President Summers has made it a priority for Harvard to think about the technology revolution, about globalization in broad terms, and how Harvard can contribute to the wider world. Important work is being done here in Harvard in a number of schools to make the links between human rights and other social and economic issues. I think, for example, of the work of Steve Marks, Jennifer Linning, and Sophia Gruskin, the work they are undertaking at the François Xavier Bagneau Center for Health and Human Rights. The center's cooperation with UNAIDS and with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child to develop model approaches for including HIV/AIDS and health issues in reports and substantive guidelines for questioning governments when they report to the committee is an invaluable form of cooperation. Michael Ignatieff and his colleagues at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy have brought their expertise to bear on projects both here in the United States and in places such as Kosovo. The law school has a long tradition of connecting human rights issues to the Harvard community and in supporting human rights activists in the field. But I would challenge all of you to consider what more could be done. One academic area that comes to mind in particular is the business sector. My friend and former UN colleague John Ruggie and I devoted a good deal of our energies to developing the UN's capacity to engage with the business community on issues of human rights, on issues of labour and environmental standards through the Secretary-General's Global Compact initiative. I'd like to congratulate John on his appointment as the director of the Kennedy School's Centre for Business and Government. The Centre's focus on corporate social responsibility and finding ways to address social programs through cooperation between public, private and non-profit sectors is, I believe, vitally important in making the global economy work for all people. I was told that Harvard Law School is creating a new program to examine changes in labour and employment law and the prospects for enforcing international labour rights standards. There's a growing debate within the business community itself on how voluntary approaches of engagement and learning, such as the Global Compact, should be linked to the normative work currently being debated in the UN Subcommission on Human Rights around corporate responsibilities for human rights protection. Business groups, such as Business for Social Responsibility here in the United States and the United Kingdom-based International Business Leaders Forum, have spoken favourably about the Subcommission's work and the value that could come from an international benchmark on corporate duties in this area. I would encourage the Kennedy School and the Law School to consider how you might enlist another key actor, Harvard Business School, to engage actively with you on questions concerning the private sector's role in the promotion and protection of human rights. I noted that little titter. And I must say, I hope and I'm confident that there are some students and faculty from the business school here this evening who would help take such an initiative forward. How could the human rights programs and centres here at Harvard work with business and other professional schools to give students the tools to think in a rights-based way and help them solve complex economic, social and environmental problems? The prospects aren't very optimistic at the moment, so I look to Harvard for leadership. A recent survey of business schools by the Aspen Institute and the World Resource Institute suggests that very little is being done to integrate social and environmental concerns into required MBA coursework or to undertake rigorous research around these areas. So you have what I remember being told about when I was a student here, you have a green field there. Fill the green field and you will give real leadership. I conclude by reiterating my belief that progress has been made in promoting throughout the world the idea of all human rights for all. But the question remains, what of the millions who suffer from deprivation of the basic means of life, or who live under terrible oppression and discrimination? When they stand up, as they will increasingly do, to claim those universal rights, what are we to say to them? I believe their future can be different. As a start, think of what could happen if the business and academic communities were to join forces in making human rights matter. As you head out the Dexter Gate to the Harvard bookstore, I recall the message carved above the gate: "Depart to serve better thy country and thy kind." I truly believe that the only way we can move forward is if human rights become part of our service and part of the rules of the road of a new, principled globalization. A globalization which affirms that our common humanity doesn't stop at national borders. A globalization that embraces Eleanor Roosevelt's vision and that of her fellow drafters of the Universal Declaration of all human rights, civil and political, economic, social and cultural, as the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in our world. Thank you.
Well, I think you can hear, Mary, what the Harvard community feels about the challenge you've addressed to us. And I think you know that you're among people who deeply respect what you've tried to do. I'm here, my name's Michael Ignatieff, Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, just to get the identifications clear. See many of my fellow students in the room. I'm going to moderate a question session. There are mics here, 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 and here. And we're going to go around the room. Questions are those very, very short statements that end in a question mark. So just remember to ask one of those, or I'm going to get ruthless and cut you off. And Mary, I'm wondering whether you could join me up here. I wanted to just get the ball rolling by asking you, we've done this before, so you know I always ask difficult questions. Two quick ones. You referred to derogation. One of the things that I think 9/11 teaches us is that the human rights instruments themselves are very, very weak guides to help us with the making sure that civil liberties are obeyed in times of terror, because there's so many derogations in the human rights instrument. Is it time for the human rights community to rethink this, the ways in which the documents themselves allow states to override rights in times of national emergency? That was question one.
Okay, I'll deal with that. That's heavy enough. I don't think that the human rights instruments, we're talking now about the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, I don't think it's weak. I think that the public opinion enforcement of it is lacking. I would invite you to contrast the attitude of two developed countries, the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom sought a formal derogation from the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights for its legislation because it knew it should. The United States did not. Where is public opinion here in the United States? How many people are writing about this?
Okay. Question two relates to, you had some very interesting things to say about the Durban conference. And what would you do differently looking back? Because the association, the degree to which what you called vile language, equating Zionism with racism, did your office inadvertently a lot of harm, did the human rights movement a lot of harm, in the sense that Zionism is a self-determination claim. That's what it is. It's a right, it's a claim of a right to self-determination. Believe me, I'm not making a political speech about this. This is too hot for a political speech. I'm saying it's a self-determination claim, like lots of others. It doesn't trump other rights. It must be reconciled with other rights, but it's a self-determination claim. So to single it out as a form of racism seems, to say the least, invidious, given that there are a host of other self-determination claims, all of which abut other self-determination claims. When you look back on that, what would you do differently? What would you tell your your successor to do about that most painful issue?
It's a fair question. As I said, it was the most difficult challenge, and I did everything that I could think of to try and make it work. Starting at the time of the Millennium Assembly, I drafted, not with lawyers, but actually with poets and philosophers, something called the Vision Statement. And I got Nelson Mandela to be a patron of it. And we got over 70 heads of state to sign that vision statement, most of them around the time of the Millennium or shortly after. I think it went up to about 90 heads of state, actually, before it was because I wanted to inject a positive approach. The problem arose at the preparatory meeting. We had preparatory meetings in each region. The one for Asia that took place in Tehran was where the problem arose. And it was an intergovernmental problem. I could do nothing about it. I wasn't in on the negotiations. But draft text was put in, which was Zionism as racism and so on. And it was in with brackets, which means it didn't apply unless the brackets were removed. And it polluted the remainder of the discussions, even in Geneva. And I put my head above the parapet, as very few international civil servants do, at the last meeting in Geneva of the preparatory discussions. And I said to the representatives of states who didn't like me saying this, I was supposed to be a civil servant, keep quiet please. I said, we have to get out all the language about Zionism as racism, this is not acceptable, but we must make some reference to the Middle East conflict. There's no way to escape that. So I didn't please either side, if you like, but it needed to be said. I regret deeply, deeply that the mandate for the United States negotiators who came to South Africa, to Durban, was so limited they could never get engaged. Because at the end of the day, we got all the language out, thanks to the leadership of South Africa and of my good friend, the Foreign Minister, Dr. Zuma. But I realized that for some reason, because of my high profile, I was in the lights, and indeed there's a particular congressman whom I've always admired for his human rights work, who for some reason identified me with everything that was negative out of Durban. There's not much I can do about that except keep repeating. But when you ask what more could you have done, I honestly think that I myself and our office did an extraordinary job. I know that I held Durban together. I can tell you that. Durban would have failed if I hadn't held it together. And I am very proud of that. And I'm very proud of the fact that I recently went to the first follow-up seminar post-Durban, which took place for the Latin American countries in Mexico. And it was a joy, because it was so positive. Brazil was telling us how much it meant for them that they were addressing the black Brazilian issue. Mexico was talking about, for the first time, properly looking at indigenous peoples. Chile, one after the other, countries were saying how much the process of Durban had helped them to confront their realities. And it was just a different issue. Since I left office just last week, there was a conference in Nairobi for the African group, which I also gather went well. So there was a particular problem which has been the public face of Durban in this country. I hope that over time we can overcome that.
I've had my go. Now we're going to go to this microphone here. If you could also identify yourself, please, before you put the question.
Sure. Daryl Matiris. I'm in the International Development Program here at the Kennedy School. To the best of my very limited knowledge, most of the tribunals and the special rapporteurs from the United Nations have focused on issues involving national level violations of human rights, or in many cases transnational. I was wondering if you see the scope of the United Nations as also covering possible individuals with terrible records of human rights violations at the provincial level in, say, developing countries. So not so much the national level or transnational level, but also at the provincial level.
That's an interesting question. The responsibility in the theory of international human rights norms and standards is that the government at national level is responsible. And so the debate and the pinning of responsibility is with the government at national level, and it's expected that within a country, regional issues will be dealt with. It's not exactly your question, but it may illustrate by example. I have raised a number of death penalty issues in this country, where it's juveniles or people who are mentally retarded, as you call it in this country, who suffer from intellectual disability when they committed the crime. And I get the answer, this isn't a federal matter, it's the state. So there is a problem at penetrating law. There's a respect for the sovereignty of states at the international level, and I think that probably will continue.
Thank you.
Up here.
I'm Christina Fu, wife of Yang Jinli, who has been detained in China for over 5 months. Yang Jinli is a Harvard graduate, is a scholar in political economy, and an outspoken advocate for democracy and human rights in China. Since his detention in April, Harvard faculties, friends, and the administration have been very concerned and very helpful. Kennedy School faculties, including Dean Joseph Nye, sent a letter to the Chinese embassy to ask for the release of Yang Jinli, and another letter by over 200 scholars, including many from Harvard, was sent to United Nations in July. I have tried many channels to get my husband released, but till today, I still have not been allowed to communicate with him in China. I have no information about where he is, how he's being treated, and whether or not he's being physically tortured. My question is, how can we use United Nations help in such individual human rights cases like my husband? Thank you.
Well, first of all, my sympathy for the very difficult situation that you find yourself in. Secondly, I believe it's extremely important in human rights work to raise individual cases. And in fact, I have raised your husband's case, and as obviously a lot of people here have done. It's always important to me, when I was in my office as High Commissioner, to work at two levels with China. I have openly said that the program of technical cooperation that we are engaged in with China is making very significant progress. I have been impressed by the last workshop that I was at a month ago was on the independence of judges and lawyers. And it really is clear to me that China is looking for a value system and that human rights may be important. But I have equally raised my deep concerns about the reality of human rights. And I have raised individual cases, and your husband's case is on the list of cases that were raised. It is extremely important, if I can just pass that message, that Harvard continues to put the pressure on. It matters. It actually matters greatly to continue that pressure, and I hope you will continue to have the support and that you will hear positive news of your husband. It is a very difficult environment, but I see changes taking place in China, and I see a paradoxical clamping down on freedoms, and they're happening at the same time, and it's hard to fully understand. But I'm, all I can say is I hope that things go well.
Question there.
Derek Lewis from the Harvard Business School. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Ready to take on the responsibility. Anyways, in my studies of history and current events, it seems like although economic innovation is critical to progress for taking people, out of despair, as you say, it's often at odds with human rights in some cases, particularly when incentives are in the wrong place. How specifically would you recommend that either public policy or joint policy between the private and public sector be adjusted to shift the incentives such that those kinds of things don't occur? Thanks.
Again, it's a good and a broad question. What I think is, first of all, the learning process is to become informed of the extent to which now economic, social and cultural rights are measurable, economic and social rights in particular, and are being measured as benchmarks of what governments are doing. And you have over 140 states, I have the figures there, I can go and look at them, but certainly over 140 states have ratified the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. You have 190 states who've ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which gives economic and social rights to all up to 18, which recognizes. And these are no longer vague aspirations. They are measurable, and they have consequences. And I recently was presented with an enormously important report of the third partner who will be joining with me in this future project on ethical globalization, the International Council on Human Rights Policy. They have full-time researchers on human rights who've done a study of the legal judgments, because there's quite a lot of jurisprudence now, of justiciability of economic, social and cultural rights in countries like South Africa and India in particular, but also how to measure the enforcement, the way in which you make governments accountable for what they have committed to. This is an issue that is not much addressed either at the academic level or political level in this country, but it's beginning to be a reality for development agencies like Oxfam, as I mentioned, and other development agencies, because they see that the tools, both of civil and political, and of economic, social and cultural rights, are an extraordinarily important deepening of democracy, where there are real problems of accountability of developing countries. So that's my answer, really. It's a broad learning curve. It's a cultural issue. It's extremely important here in the United States that it be appreciated how significant it is for the promotion of human rights to take seriously economic, social and cultural rights, and to pin the governments who have ratified the relevant conventions, and I also include the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. Because the United States has not ratified the 3 core conventions, it's harder in this country to psychologically understand the importance for both developed and developing countries worldwide. I just wish that that argument could be raised at the highest political level in this country. It would make such a difference for human rights.
Question here, and then we hope, if we get lucky, to go around back and start again. So keep it short so we can do justice to all the people at the mic.
President Robinson, I'm one of the women who is very grateful to you for standing up for what is right and moral. My name is Merve Kavakçı. I'm a Mason Fellow at Kennedy School and a former member of Turkish Parliament. And I became the parliamentarian who served for the very shortest time, for 45 minutes, till I was ousted for standing in the parliament in this outfit that I'm standing before you. So this is more than a privilege for me to be in the cradle of information. You have iterated in your speech that we have to make human rights matter in places close to home. Therefore, my question will concern my constituents, my Turkish people, Turkish women in particular. In a country where Turkish women have only rights as long as they look very much secular, and many thousands of them have shattered futures due to the fact that they would like to keep their scarves on with their own will, where Turkish government only promulgates international conventions, including Human Rights Declaration and CEDAW, but does not enforce them. What would be your take on the methods in which we can pin our governments to their commitments and keep them accountable?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for telling me your personal story. And secondly, there is no conflict or no difficulty between what you have asserted quite rightly as your right and the international human rights instruments, including CEDAW. It's a distortion if anybody were to suggest otherwise. And it is extraordinarily important that it be fully realized that the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women also respects religion and respects tradition, which does not in itself cause a transgression of women's rights. The most clear example is female genital mutilation, and we've been able to make that standard now in African countries using the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. But if I can just use what you said very briefly to say that one of the most moving experiences I had in the last year was to be in Kabul, in Afghanistan, on International Women's Day, and to hear these brave Afghan women assert their rights as they had done in such difficult circumstances. But they were asserting their rights under Islamic law. They were evoking their religion. They were making it perfectly clear. They were not secular. They didn't want to be. They didn't believe this had anything to do with the full expression of their rights. And it was extremely moving. And the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women fully supports that position and honours and respects it and is enriched by it. So keep your principles and keep on in the full knowledge they are fully in accord with international human rights law.
Question here.
My name is Sarah Berkson, and I'm a second-year student also from the Harvard Business School. One of the reasons why I chose to come to Harvard was because of its focus on training leaders versus managers. And the curriculum has focused and supported by the case study methodology has been used to challenge issues such as child labor, environmental sustainability, and corporate responsibility within the first and third world. This has impressed me, not only from the curriculum level, but also from the student level. For instance, Consortium on Global Leadership is the only tri-school club that allows Harvard Business School students, Kennedy students, and law school students to come together to link and forge ties, not only for the short term, but the long term. So in terms of your challenge, I would like to personally invite you to the Greenfield on the other side of the campus to attend one of our case study methods to allow you to personally see what some of the advantages are of the business school and the contributions they're making to this university.
Well, thank you for that staunch defense. Actually, I had an opportunity earlier sitting with some of your colleagues, and they were saying the same thing you're saying, so thank you.
Up here.
My name is Oren Weinrib. I want to ask a question about the capability of the UN to critique for example, the United States. Just laying two possibilities on the table, something like when the U.S. supports paramilitaries, for example, in Nicaragua and Colombia, that lead directly or indirectly to human rights abuses in those countries. What is the, as former UN Human Rights Commissioner, what is the capability of the UN to then critique the United States and to have some effect here, looking particularly, for example, at the Iraq sanctions, and I believe the Biological Warfare Convention. There was a lot of pressure put by the U.S. forcing certain people to step down in the UN. So I'm wondering, what's that like?
Again, it's an interesting question that requires a kind of sense of the capability overall within the United Nations system. The Office of the High Commissioner is a small office. We focus on certain egregious human rights problems worldwide, and you have to focus on the worst if you're small, because they're the ones that really matter. So by and large, until relatively recently, it meant that countries like the United States were not likely to be criticized, because it was a healthy democracy within the United States criticizing Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, etc. But since the 11th of September, it has been actually important to voice a criticism of the United States not explicitly upholding international human rights and humanitarian law standards, because they were also attacked when there were the attacks on the 9/11. They weren't just at innocent civilians or people, they were also attacks on democracy and freedom. And what I found as High Commissioner in my work was when I tried to address the problems in less democratic countries, they would say, oh, look, standards have changed. Look what they're doing in the United States. So it became extremely important to address the problem in the United States because it had spillover problems on standards internationally. Otherwise, except for the death penalty issue and a few other issues, and the lack of an openness to economic and social rights, the United States doesn't weigh in the scale because other countries have much more serious problems, and we should rightly focus on where the serious problems are. That's the best answer I can give you.
My watch says we got 4 minutes. So we might get around if we're lucky, so keep it short.
Commissioner Robinson, my name is Dave Capel. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School and a student of Professor Ignatieff. I'm also the mayor of a small village on Long Island in New York State named Greenport. My question to you is with respect to your statement that the UN has deferred to national governments in the promotion of human rights. I suspect that might not be an effective undertaking. In my village, if you were to approach the average person on the street, and my village is a working class town with a significant population of poor people. In my village, if you were to ask the typical person on the street what they know about the Declaration of Human Rights, they would say nothing. So I question whether or not it may be, particularly in the United States where local activism is what this country grew out of, that perhaps a campaign for adoption of the human rights declarations at the local level could be effective in promoting its consideration more seriously at the higher levels of government.
Well, thank you. You may recall that one of the first points I made was the importance, in fact, of education about the Universal Declaration, the whole sophisticated build-up of the human rights instruments, the 6 core instruments that we talk about, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the 2 covenants on civil and political rights, on economic, social and cultural rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. They're the 6 key instruments. There are also protocols, there are declarations, there are various things. And I would agree with you, unfortunately, these are still not part of the everyday in our schools, in our universities, as they should be. We tried during the 50th anniversary year of the Universal Declaration, when I was last here speaking in Harvard. That was a great year to promote the Universal Declaration. We got the Guinness Book of Records. It's been translated into more languages than any other instrument. I used to have it hanging in my study, and I was very proud of that. But still, I agree with you. There's a lot to be done. But it has to be done, I think, within countries and by civil societies, by universities, etc. The UN can only provide the norms and standards and the incentive, but it has to be done within countries.
You got lucky. You got the last question. Make it good.
All right, I'll try to. The pressure's on. My name is Josh Lumiere. I'm a sophomore at the college. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Commissioner Robinson, for coming and for your words of encouragement. I realize that this issue has already been brought up at the beginning of the question session, but I still can't forget the fiasco which happened at the Durban conference, where supposedly nations were going to come together to work together to eliminate racism from the world, and it ended up becoming a violent attack on Israel and Zionism in particular. And I find equally disturbing that within the United Nations itself, there was often heard last year a call to condemn Israel, which is the only democratic nation in the Middle East, of crimes against humanity. Personally, I've prided myself that I've dedicated a lot of my time in the pursuit of human rights at a local level. And I just wanted to know, how is it possible? How can I trust that the UN Commission on Human Rights will work to eliminate the violence of racism, pursue human rights without bias, and without becoming a forum to target Israel or any other nation in particular, which in of itself, in my opinion at least, is discrimination and as such a violation of human rights?
Okay, I think it's actually fair to come back to this issue because it is a very crucial issue. There are two different things I think you've raised. One was the Durban conference. I think it's important to recognize, we had the same thing the other day in Johannesburg. It's only at the very end of a conference you get the final text. And one of the issues in Johannesburg was women's rights. I went out on a picket in Johannesburg, and I'm a bit old to be going out on a picket at my age, but I did because I was so worried that paragraph 47 of the text would put back the women's movement by making women's health issues subject to traditional practices and religion, and nothing about international standards. Luckily, at the end it didn't happen, but what I'm trying to illustrate is the same thing was true in Durban. Until the last minute, there was bad bracketed text. There were hate speeches and hate language and abuse of people in Durban. I stood up against it. At one evening I said, I am a Jew, what is this all about? And I took on the human rights, the NGOs, some of them, because a lot of them were against this. And indeed I didn't endorse the human rights, the NGO document. I said I won't endorse it because you have this Zionism as racism in it, and that's not on. So, that was all there. But have you read the text of Durban? I challenge you to read the Declaration and Programme of Action and write to me if there's still something in it that troubles you, because I don't think you'll find it. I genuinely don't. And that's the irony. I don't think you'll find anything in it. Now, you raised a different issue, which is the terrible tragedy of what is happening at the moment in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. That was one of the most difficult challenges for me as High Commissioner. Every time I issued a statement or did anything, I primed myself, remember to be fair, remember to be balanced. I condemned the suicide killings. I had to speak out very strongly about the long-term effect of the occupation because I saw it myself. When I was there in November 2000 and reported afterwards to the Commission, it was so evident that the heart of the human rights issue is the occupation. It's so humiliating for people to be occupied, not to be free to travel. I talked to women doctors who had a program in both the West Bank and Gaza. This was before the Intifada. They were talking about it. The Intifada started when I was talking to them, but they said before the Intifada, if they tried to go as doctors to the West Bank for their work with children, they were often strip searched. It's just the sheer problems. You have to be there to see it. And I'm not taking sides on this. I'm genuinely not politically motivated in any way. I have a pure human rights agenda. It's extremely important to me because what is happening in the conflict between Israel and the occupied territories is very, very detrimental to human rights because on both sides there is a sense of double standards. For the Palestinians, they say the United States backs Israel through thick and thin, therefore the UN resolutions are never complied with, that's double standards. Israel says we're targeted. We were targeted in Durban, we're targeted in the UN, this is double standards. And I cannot tell you how important it was to me. I may not have always called it right, but I always wanted to to have an integrity of the human rights message. But in the integrity of the human rights message, I totally condemned, vocally and often, and raised with the Palestinian authorities that I met, the absolute unacceptability of suicide bombings or attacks on civilians of any kind. And secondly, I had to say that the balance of what is the human rights problem is stemming from the occupation, and the sooner that there is a political resolution, the sooner there are two states that can live together as neighbours, the sooner there can be a political resolution, the better. Because at the moment, it is the most difficult human rights problem. But you're right to mention it. It's a heartache. I feel it very strongly, and I share your sense of worry about it.
I think we've had an unforgettable object lesson in the extraordinarily controversial nature of human rights as a set of commitments, the extreme difficulty it takes to retain the integrity of the human rights message through thick and thin, the extreme complexity of problems of double standards. I think I'd want to salute the intellectual honesty and courage of our speaker tonight, and I know you've already expressed your gratitude to her. Why not do it again?
Good job. Oh, I didn't put any of this together. I just sat in on. No, I actually didn't. I was I just got to put all the fruit, all of the labor. Like I didn't do anything. Really? She was there. Kind of the same thing. Yeah, she. Yeah, she's really good.
Not good for you. You're what?
I was working on getting depressed, and I had to